The town of Cold Falls, Colorado, sat tucked between the dark shoulders of the mountains like an afterthought, a speck of light and silence on the map. There were no highways that really went through it, only roads that happened to pass by. The kind of place you saw once from a bus window and then forgot existed. Jack Mercer had lived there most of his life. He wasn't born to be a voice on the radio, more like someone who stumbled into it. He'd been a musician once, played bass in a small bar band that never made it out of the county. When that ended, and when his marriage dissolved not long after, the radio job was what remained. A quiet shift that started at midnight and ended when the sun came up. No one bothered him there, no expectations, just static, vinyl, and the sound of his own breathing in the dark. The station, KCFX 104.6 FM, was housed in what used to be an insurance office, its yellow light bleeding into the cold streets after midnight. The building smelled of burnt dust and old wires. Paint peeled off the corners where the heat never reached. A single, on-air bulb glowed like a small red moon above the booth window. And for Jack, it felt almost holy, that tiny sphere of light, meaning someone, somewhere, might be listening. He called his program Midnight Frequency, a name he'd thought of years ago, half as a joke, half as a prayer. It was never meant to be popular. The show didn't have callers or sponsors, just stories, records, and the kind of music people used to fall asleep to, before the world learned to scroll instead of dream. Jack's voice had that soft, low rasp that comes from too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. Each night he'd lean toward the microphone and say the same words, slow and measured. It's 12:01, and you're tuned to Midnight Frequency. If you're awake, you're one of us. He liked the idea of that. A secret club of night people, truckers, janitors, security guards, or anyone too haunted to rest. Sometimes he imagined the voices of his listeners drifting back through the static, ghosts of insomniacs whispering through the ether. Cold Falls was quiet at night, almost unnaturally so. The mountains trapped sound, muffled it. The only thing Jack ever heard through the cracked studio window was the distant hum of the river, and sometimes the groan of freight trains far beyond the ridge. He'd been doing this job for 9 years. Every night the same. Drive up the winding road, unlock the station, flip the breaker, wait for the boards to warm up. The building seemed to breathe as it came alive. A faint electrical sigh, the pop of tubes heating in the transmitter. Then came the soft hiss of static, the heartbeat of the station. Jack kept a small picture of his daughter on the console. Emma, 9 years old, the last time he saw her. She lived with her mother now, somewhere in Oregon. They talked every few months, polite but distant. He didn't blame her mother for leaving. The radio had taken all of him. It filled the hours he should have spent as a husband and father. Sometimes, when the snow piled against the glass and the whole world outside seemed frozen, he'd talk directly to Emma over the airwaves, not that she'd ever hear it. He'd just tell stories about the stars, about the old songs, about how silence can be louder than sound. There was a particular comfort in that, in knowing he was broadcasting into emptiness. It made him feel less alone. But lately, he'd started to wonder if the emptiness was listening back. It began a week before Christmas, when the nights felt longer than usual. The mountain air had a stillness to it, the kind that presses against your skin. Jack was halfway through his show, spinning a slow jazz record from the 50s, when he noticed a faint pattern in the static, a rhythm that didn't belong, not random, not chaotic, almost like breathing. He leaned closer to the console, tapping one of the dials. The signal flickered for a moment, then settled. It was probably interference from the highway transmitters, he thought. Happens all the time. But when the song ended and he faded the sound down, the pattern remained. Soft, distant, pulsing through the silence. He frowned, turned the gain up slightly. For a second, it sounded almost like someone whispering behind the noise. He pulled off his headphones, and the sound vanished. The room was quiet again. The comforting buzz of the lights, the hum of old machines, the slow tick of the clock on the wall. Still, something in that sound clung to him for the rest of the night. Not fear exactly, more like curiosity, a vibration just below understanding. When his shift ended at sunrise, he stepped outside and locked the station door. The valley below was still, wrapped in fog. He looked out toward the faint outline of the town, the diner, the post office, the few homes scattered along the main street. A sleepy, harmless place. And yet, as the cold air bit at his throat, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, for the first time in years, someone was actually trying to reach him. For the next few nights, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the sound he'd heard. It haunted the edges of every broadcast, that faint, rhythmic pulse buried beneath the static, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to the equipment. He checked the cables, the transmitter, even the old mixing board whose meters had long since started flickering out of sync. Everything worked. Everything was fine. Yet every night around 2:17 a.m., the signal would rise again, thin, metallic, distant. A breath through wires. By the third night, Jack decided to record it. He loaded an old tape reel and let it spin through the early hours, capturing the silence between songs. The next morning, when he rewound it and pressed play, the tape whispered. At first it was faint, like wind passing through dry leaves. But then, behind the white noise, came something else, a sound too deliberate to be an accident. A voice, slow and hollow, wrapped in distortion. He couldn't make out the words at first, but as he listened again, turning the volume higher and higher, a single name emerged. Eddie Klein. Jack froze. Eddie Klein owned the gas station down on Route 19. He'd been there forever, a heavy-set man with a laugh too loud for such a small town. Everyone knew him. The voice faded, and Jack sat staring at the console, heart hammering. The reel spun on, the hiss of the tape filling the room like breath. By the time the morning light pushed through the blinds, he'd almost convinced himself it was a trick of the static, an audio illusion, a mix of noise that just happened to sound like a name he knew. The human brain, he reasoned, was built to find patterns, even when there were none. That evening, when he stopped for coffee at the diner, 2 sheriff's cruisers sat out front. Inside, a pair of deputies were talking quietly to the waitress. The radio behind the counter murmured about the weather, snow incoming, roads likely to close by nightfall. Jack slid onto a stool. The waitress, an older woman named Ruth, looked pale. She told him Eddie Klein hadn't opened the station that morning. His truck was still parked by the pumps, keys inside, but no sign of him. His wife had called the sheriff after finding the door locked from the inside. They were calling it missing, under unusual circumstances. Jack's hand tightened around his coffee cup. The sound of the tape replayed in his mind, that whispery voice speaking through the static. Eddie Klein. That night, when he returned to the station, the silence felt different. It wasn't comforting anymore. It pressed against him, like something breathing just beyond the walls. he tried to focus on the broadcast. He played the usual records, read the same half-hearted horoscope segments he'd written years ago. But when he reached for the next song, the mixer light flickered on its own. A sharp green blink across the console, like something unseen had touched it. And then the signal returned. At first it came softly, almost shyly, threading through the spaces between frequencies. The same voice, thin and distant. But this time it didn't say a name. It said a place. The river. The word stretched through the noise, distorted and low, as though traveling across miles of static. Jack sat frozen. The VU meters danced without pattern, the dials on the transmitter shifting slightly, though no hand touched them. He let the sound play for a few seconds before cutting to a record, pretending everything was fine. But his fingers trembled on the controls. The next day, the sheriff's office found Eddie Klein's truck again, this time half a mile down by the Cold Falls River. The doors were open. The snow around it was undisturbed except for one long drag mark leading down toward the frozen water. They didn't find Eddie. For 2 nights after, Jack barely slept. He sat in his apartment above the hardware store, the radio silent, his thoughts louder than anything he'd ever broadcast. It had to be coincidence, he told himself again and again. People disappeared all the time. Small towns had their tragedies. But the next time he entered the studio, the on-air light was already glowing, though he hadn't turned it on. He stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the soft red bulb. Then, slowly, he sat at the console, turned on his headphones, and listened. There it was again, the static, the pulse, and beneath it, a voice he now recognized as the same one from before, low, distant, like a transmission from somewhere just beyond reach. Only this time, it didn't say a name. It said his. Jack. The word rippled through the noise like a drop of ink in water, spreading until it filled every corner of the room. Jack tore off the headphones. The sound was gone. The silence swallowed everything. He sat there for a long time, staring at his own reflection in the studio glass, pale, hollow-eyed, alone. The tape reels spun on behind him, recording nothing but the hum of a world that was starting to sound less and less alive. By the end of that week, Cold Falls no longer felt real. It looked the same from a distance, the same narrow streets winding between frozen pines, the same flicker of lights in the diner windows. But something in it had gone hollow. The air carried a strange stillness, as if sound itself had grown heavy. Jack drove to work each night along the same road, but the town seemed to be retreating behind him, fading the farther he went. Houses that used to glow faintly in the dark were now black silhouettes. The main street, once dotted with neon, had turned into a corridor of silence. On his third night after the incident with the voice, he noticed that even the station's signal logs, the little printouts that tracked transmissions, had begun showing gaps. Whole hours were missing, blank stretches of nothing between the songs. He asked around the next day, half-jokingly, if anyone had been having trouble with the radio lately. The sheriff said he'd been hearing nothing but static on his patrol car's receiver. The waitress at the diner told him the weather broadcast kept looping the same sentence. Stay tuned for local updates. Jack nodded, smiled politely, but he didn't say it out loud. That it was his station's voice she was hearing, and that it wasn't broadcasting anything anymore. When he returned to KCFX that night, something about the building felt different. The air was colder, thinner. The light in the hallway flickered just once before dying completely. Only the red on-air bulb glowed steadily in the booth, bathing the room in a dim pulse of crimson. He switched on the transmitter, more from habit than purpose. The hum that followed was deeper now, almost resonant. As the signal stabilized, the faint, rhythmic breathing returned. Slow, measured, like someone just behind the static waiting to speak. Jack stared at the console. The gain meter began to rise on its own. And then the voice came through again, clearer than ever before. Hannah Price. The name struck him like a bell. Hannah Price was a school teacher, one of the few people who still waved when he passed her car in town. He tried to dismiss it. Maybe it wasn't the same voice. Maybe it wasn't even the same frequency. But the next morning, a bulletin appeared on the sheriff's board. Hannah Price, missing. Her car had been found idling outside the elementary school, driver's door wide open, radio still tuned to 104.6 FM. Jack sat in his truck across from the building for nearly an hour, listening to the static hum through his dashboard. It wasn't random. It pulsed in the same pattern he'd been hearing for days, like Morse code he couldn't decipher. By now, the voice had become a nightly ritual. It arrived between 2 and 3 a.m., always preceded by a high electrical whine that made the speakers rattle. Each time, a new name followed, and each time, someone else vanished. After Hannah, it was Ruth from the diner, then Deputy Morrow, then the mechanic who fixed Jack's car. By the 7th night, there were fewer lights in the valley. The sheriff's patrols stopped passing by the station. The phone stopped ringing entirely. And yet every night, the on-air light burned steady, as if someone somewhere still waited to hear him. Jack stopped trying to fight it. He didn't even open the mic anymore. He just sat in the dark and listened, waiting for the voice to return. Sometimes it spoke slowly, drawing out each name until it dissolved into static. Other times it would repeat the same word again and again like a record skipping, words that began to sound less like names and more like echoes. On the 10th night, the voice changed. It began to speak in his voice, not perfectly. The tone was thinner, emptier, as if it were made of the space between sounds. But the cadence was unmistakable. The same quiet way he spoke into the microphone, the same rhythm, even the same pauses. The transmission repeated phrases from his own broadcasts, late-night monologues he'd spoken months ago, years ago, things he barely remembered saying. If you're awake, you're one of us. The words spilled into the room, coming back to him from somewhere far away, like a recording from a place that shouldn't exist. He played back the station's archives, searching for the original air dates. None of them matched. The logs were blank. The tapes didn't exist. And then, while rewinding one of the reels, he heard something he had never recorded, a faint cough, followed by the scraping sound of a chair. Then, his own voice whispering, "They're gone, Jack." He froze. The room seemed to contract around him, sound bending, air thickening. He turned to look through the booth window into the empty hallway. But there was nothing there, only the faint reflection of himself in the glass. That night, as dawn approached, Jack stepped outside the studio for the first time in days. The air was still, too still. The valley below was gray and lifeless. The lights in town were all out, even the diner's sign. The roads were unmarked, covered in a thin dust that looked like frost but wasn't cold to the touch. He drove down toward the square. Every building stood intact, but the windows were dark, hollow. No movement, no sound, no breath. Cold Falls wasn't just quiet anymore. It was gone. The world had emptied itself like a drained frequency. A broadcast cut mid-sentence. Jack drove back to the station and sat in the parking lot for a long time, staring at the tower above him. Its red beacon blinked once every few seconds, steady as a heartbeat. The last heartbeat left in town. When he went inside, the console was already alive, meters flickering, reels spinning. The voice was waiting for him. And this time, when it spoke, it didn't sound distant at all. It sounded like it was sitting right next to him. Jack Mercer. The sound filled the booth like air. He looked at the microphone. The on-air light glowed brighter than it ever had before, almost white now, buzzing softly. And for the first time in 9 years, Jack didn't know whether he was broadcasting or just receiving. By the 12th night, Jack Mercer had stopped keeping track of time. The clocks in the studio no longer ticked. The hands stayed frozen at different hours, as if the building itself couldn't decide what night it was. The calendar on the wall still said December, but he wasn't sure which December anymore. Outside the windows, the mountains were blank shapes against a gray sky. The snow that had fallen days ago hadn't melted, but it also hadn't grown, as if the world had stopped in the middle of a breath. The air held that strange metallic taste that had become familiar to him now, the taste of static before it speaks. The town was silent. No engines, no wind, no distant hum of the river, just silence so complete it seemed alive. Inside the booth, Jack sat in front of the console with the headphones around his neck. He hadn't gone home in days, if home still existed. He slept between broadcasts, drank from a thermos of stale coffee, and stared at the waveform monitor, where the signal still pulsed in faint green lines. 104.6 FM was still broadcasting, but he no longer knew to whom. He'd stopped hearing the voice for a while. 2 nights, maybe 3. He thought, maybe it's over. Maybe the frequency finally burned itself out. But that hope died when the signal returned, stronger than before, more deliberate, like a heartbeat under glass. At 2:17 a.m., the voice came through again. It didn't whisper this time. It spoke clearly, evenly, as if sitting across from him in the dim red glow. Jack Mercer. Jack didn't move. The sound filled the booth. It was his own voice again, but deeper, slower, hollowed out. He could hear the breath before each word, the scrape of the microphone. "You're on the air." The console lights flickered in rhythm with the words. The tape reels turned, though he hadn't loaded any tape. The on-air bulb glowed so bright it hurt his eyes. He tried to speak into the mic, his instinct, his ritual. But no sound came out. His throat tightened. The air felt too thick to breathe. When he finally forced the words, they came out cracked, dry, barely human. "Who are you?" The reply came instantly. "You!" The studio filled with static. A roar, then a pulse, then silence. On the monitors, he saw the signal spike, the frequency doubling back on itself, like a wave folding into an echo. He turned every knob to 0, cut every channel, but the voice didn't stop. It no longer came from the speakers. It came through the air itself. The building vibrated gently as though the walls were humming. Jack stood up, dizzy, staring at the window into the dark hallway. Beyond it, nothing. The reflection showed the booth perfectly. The console, the chair, the glowing red light. But it didn't show him. He stepped closer, touched the glass. It was cold, but his reflection didn't follow. The hum grew louder. The VU meters slammed to their limits. The air shimmered with a faint electrical haze, the smell of ozone and dust. Then faintly, beneath the noise, music. Not from his library, not from any record he owned. A tune from decades ago, a soft jazz instrumental full of hiss and vinyl crackle, the kind of song that would have played on someone's radio in the 1950s. As it played, Jack heard voices beneath it, laughter, chatter, fragments of broadcasts from long ago. Snatches of his own shows drifted through, woven into the melody like memories. You're listening to Midnight Frequency. His voice from every night, all overlapping, spiraling through the static until the words no longer meant anything. He stumbled back, knocking over his chair. The noise rose to a shriek, and then silence. When he opened his eyes, the console was dead, the lights off, the room dark except for a faint red glow from the on-air bulb, which somehow still burned. He looked around. The walls looked older, the posters yellowed, the coffee mug coated in dust, the clock on the wall, cracked, unmoving. And then he saw it. On the console lay a reel-to-reel tape, labeled in faded marker. Last broadcast, Jack Mercer. The handwriting was his. He reached for it with shaking hands, slid it onto the player, pressed rewind. The reels turned sluggishly, the tape whining softly. When it stopped, he pressed play. The sound that filled the room wasn't static. It was his voice, calm, steady, professional, introducing his show. It's 12:01, and you're tuned to Midnight Frequency. If you're awake, you're one of us. He listened, numb. The broadcast continued. Music, then his quiet stories. The same pattern as always. But as the hours on the tape went by, his tone began to change. He sounded nervous, then frantic, then barely coherent. At the end of the recording, his voice whispered something so softly it was almost lost beneath the static. "They're gone, Jack. You're the only one left." The tape stopped. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then the transmitter clicked on by itself. The boards glowed, meters flickered, and the air filled again with that low hum. The voice returned, but this time, it didn't come through the headphones. It came from outside. "If anyone's out there, you're not alone." Jack looked toward the window. Through the glass, beyond the faint reflection, he saw the booth, the chair, the microphone, and sitting there, in his seat, was himself. The figure leaned toward the mic and smiled faintly. The on-air light flared bright white. Then everything went still. Morning never came to Silverton. At least not the kind that warmed anything. The horizon stayed the same washed-out gray, as if the sun had forgotten the way here. The snow along the station's parking lot had turned to a crust of ice, littered with fallen branches and tire tracks that led nowhere. For the first time in weeks, the doors of WZRH 104.6 FM stood closed. A thin sheet of frost clung to the glass. Inside, the air was still, too still, as if the whole building were holding its breath. The lobby clock had stopped at 3:02 a.m. The phone on the reception desk blinked with one unheard message. "This is Officer Dalton. If anyone at the station gets this, please call back. We found Mr. Mercer's car abandoned near mile marker 9. His keys were still inside. The message clicked off into silence. Beyond the lobby, the hallway stretched into shadow. The walls were lined with framed photographs, smiling hosts, charity events, the station's 50th anniversary celebration. Every photo had collected a soft film of dust, the faces dimming beneath it. At the end of the corridor, the studio door hung slightly ajar. A faint hum leaked through, a low, steady tone like the world's quietest heartbeat. The red, on-air light above the door was still glowing. Inside, the booth looked almost exactly as Jack had left it. The console lights flickered weakly. The microphone stood upright, the headphones draped over the arm of his chair. On the desk sat the reel-to-reel tape marked "Last Broadcast," the film fully wound, unmoving. Only one thing had changed. The VU meters on the console pulsed steadily. Something, or someone, was still transmitting. If you turned on a radio anywhere within 20 miles of Silverton, tuned it carefully to 104.6, and waited, you'd hear it. The faint crackle of static, the low hum, and beneath it, a man's voice, calm and certain, cutting through the emptiness. It's 12:01, and you're tuned to Midnight Frequency. Sometimes, after a few seconds, listeners reported hearing faint noises in the background, footsteps, the whisper of paper, a distant echo, like laughter. Some said they could make out words, something about the signal never dying. The station officially shut down in 1997. The building was later condemned, but no record exists of who disconnected the transmitter, if anyone ever did. And yet, on clear winter nights, when the wind comes down from the mountains and the air is sharp enough to sting, you can still catch it. 104.6 FM, Midnight Frequency. The voice of a man who stayed on the air long after the world went quiet. No one knows if it's a loop, a trick of the signal, or something else. But one thing is certain. When the static fades just enough to hear the next line, you'll always hear him say, "If anyone's out there, you're not alone." Then comes the sound of breathing. Slow, close, as if he's waiting for you to answer. And then, only white noise.